Hello, everyone. I'm Zed Adams, the chair of the philosophy department here at the New School for Social Research. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the inaugural meeting of our summer talk series here at the NSSR. Series is titled The Current Moment, Perspectives from the Social Sciences and Humanities. We've got 11 talks lined up, and I invite all of you to join us for all of these talks. I think it'll be an exciting series. The series was conceived by myself and Robert Kostreva, the Vice Dean here at the New School for Social Research, where we were inspired by the following thought. We live in a time in which there's a wealth of explainer articles out there, articles that give you in-depth analysis of the current moment. Think in the New York Times or the New Yorker, Atlantic, or online magazines like Vox, Medium, and Aeon. These articles take existing questions that you already have and provide very clear answers to them. Well, the thought that inspired our series was that the faculty at the NSSR have a different kind of contribution to make to understanding the current moment, where our faculty raise questions that you don't already have about what's going on around us and provide an in-depth academic approach to answering those rather non-standard and perhaps unthought questions. And the hope is that this series will make manifest the value of the work of our faculty and engaging with that work in a university setting. So having said all of that, I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Setterfield, professor and chair of the economics department. He's the author of, among many other things, a brand new textbook on heterodox macroeconomics. And I'd like to end by just drawing attention to one question that Mark's work has raised for me that I didn't have before. So we're all familiar with the kind of tremendous rise in income inequality over the past few decades. It's been a kind of, enormous rise. But engaging with Mark's work made me realize that I never wondered before why, even in spite of this rise in income inequality, why there's actually why the workers today are less willing than before to bargain for higher wages than they have in the past. So why, in the face of a rise in inequality, do you see a decrease in the amount of willingness to bargain for higher wages? I think that's a really interesting question. Mark's work has a lot to say in response to that. So that said, here's the structure of our talk today. Mark's going to give about a half-hour talk, and then I'm going to field questions for Mark, and he's going to answer them. We have about a half hour for that. So after his talk, please, there's two ways in which we're going to field questions. One is through text. So click on the attendees part of the right-hand side of your Zoom window, and you can type in the chat questions that you might have. Oh, sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A window. We're also going to have the chat open for people just to discuss what they're thinking about during the talk. But if you have a question, please ask it in the Q&A. And then we also have the option of people asking questions via video. So raise your hand in the attendees section and I'll call on you if you want to ask a question in person. So that said, Mark, please take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Zed, for that introduction. And in fact, thanks to you and Robert for putting this series together. It looks fascinating. I'll be back as an audience member in the future, I know, and hopefully I can get the series off to a good start today. You've already raised, the topic of inequality. That's something I'll come back to in the course of my talk today. And also the relationship between inequality and bargaining power. That's a fascinating relationship right there that we could probably have a separate session on. But these are all big questions, and they're all certainly related in one way or another, I think, to the way things are and are likely to continue to play out in the current moment. So I'll try to talk, if I can, and this might be ambitious, for 20 minutes rather than 30, just to create more time for questions and answers. But of course, it's easy to sort of, especially as a macroeconomist, when you get big macroeconomic events, it's easy to keep talking. So I'll try to limit myself one way or the other. All right, let's start at the beginning then. Here we go again. We're already in the midst of what I think it's fair to say is going to be another recession of historic proportions. We're only sort of 10 years out from the financial crisis and Great Recession, which itself was seen as some, sort of second half of the 20th century anomaly, because you had to go all the way back to the Great Depression in the 1930s to find a similar event. And as I say, here we go again, only 10 years after the Great Recession. But I think it's important to begin by noting that this time is different. The Great Recession, of course, as we all know, was really created initially by a financial crisis. So something was rotten in the state of the economy, and that pulled the economy down. It was very much a series of economic outcomes that were really precipitated by economic events. Whereas this time, of course, you probably couldn't find a better example of what economists like to refer to as exogenous shocks. Some sort of event from outside the economy that has an initial impact on the economy itself. I mean, obviously COVID-19 comes from the natural realm, not even the social realm. So in the first instance here, we sort of have an economy, we're looking at an economy responding to an exogenous shock. So in the first instance, it's a little bit like stepping on a hose pipe. You might have your hose pipe plugged in, the water's turned on, everything's functioning normally, and then someone with a big boot comes along, steps on the hose pipe, and the water stops flowing. Now, had that been short-lived, had the boot been removed from the hose pipe, then there's every reason to think that the water would have started flowing again. And well, then we would have had something like a V-shaped recession, a sort of quick restriction of production and trade that was followed by the reopening of production and trade, and probably reversion to pretty much where we were beforehand. And if you go back to sort of January, February, where there was still hope, I think in many quarters, that this was largely going to be a problem restricted to China. A lot of the discussion there was about temporary interruptions to supply chains, as if we could just get those supply chains reconnected and everything would be back to normal in a trice. And in fairness, so it probably would have been. But of course, we now know differently. COVID-19, this sort of natural event imposing itself on the social world, is a far nastier proposition. It's become a global pandemic, and it's quite clear that if it's not here to stay, then certainly the social response to its presence is it's going to take more than a few weeks or even months to get back to any semblance of normal as we might have thought of it, at least in the US, in the early part of this year. So in a sense then, we have undoubtedly then somebody stepping on the hose pipe for a longer period of time. The restriction on production and trade that is coming about as a result of social distancing itself is going to persist. But I think this is also where now the economics starts to take over, and we're now going to start to get more economic causes of nasty economic outcomes that we're going to experience over the course of the recession that we've now entered. So a lot of these sort of nasty economic causes are actually going to start coming now from the demand side. They already have, in fact. In the first instance, of course, if you step on the economic hose pipe, you always get a magnified response because of simple multiplier effects. So if you shut down production and trade because of social distancing in response to a virus, then of course that imposes an immediate loss of income on certain groups of businesses and workers. But of course they're using that income to fund expenditures. Those expenditures get cut so that other businesses and workers' income goes down, even if they actually remain open for business. And that sort of ripple effect carries on through the economy, and that's just a standard multiplier effect. That effect, I think, is actually now the least significant, though, economic cause of further distress that we're experiencing, because, of course, the severity of the crisis, as we now understand it, has created an enormous increase in the, at least, awareness of the uncertainty of the future. The fact that we never really know where we're going in the future, and at a time like this, more so than ever. We don't yet understand the virus. We don't really know what it's going to take in order to organize our way around it until some sort of vaccination appears, if indeed a vaccination ever appears, because we're uncertain about that as well. So going all the way back to Keynes, the standard economic discussion of what happens when there is an increase in uncertainty, or even just an increase in the aversion to or awareness of uncertainty, is you get a peak in liquidity preference. Essentially what that means is that even households and businesses, I mean, households like my own, for example, who have been perhaps least affected up until now by the economic consequences of the crisis, will start to hoard purchasing power. Effectively, we're all afraid of what is going to happen in the future because we simply don't know what's going to happen in the future. What we do know is that in order to pay rent, in order to service our mortgages, in order to meet debt commitments, we're going to need access to cash, if you like, the means of payment. So cancelling expenditure plans now makes sense just in case our future income streams are adversely affected by unemployment, for example, or the permanent shutdown of our business because we haven't managed to weather the early stages of the crisis. So this is very much the sort of thing that Keynes drew attention to in the 1930s. You get gales of uncertainty, a tremendous amount of, if not outright pessimism, then certainly caution, let's call it, about the future, which really results in the cancellation of expenditure plans. The next thing I think, and this could actually, let's hope not, but this could be the next shoe to drop, is what happens if the kind of combination of the effects that I've described so far, then introduce a financial dimension into the crisis. Because let's not forget, one of the things, and of course any students in the audience are only too aware of this, one of the things that we're all under an obligation to do is to service our debts. And if you're going to restrict income, and in fact impose a loss of income on many businesses and households, well, then the capacity to service debt is thrown into question. And of course, when that happens, we get the prospect of default. And when we get the prospect of default, this is what's going to introduce then a financial dimension. And I'm calling it a financial dimension because it may or may not become then a financial crisis as an outgrowth of the original COVID crisis. Again, let's hope not. At the very least, default is going to, of course, affect the ability of those who default to borrow in the future. It's going to affect the proclivity of creditors to extend credit. So you've got a further clamp down here on demand that is coming from credit financed sources. And well, of course, in the worst case, we all know what a financial crisis looks like because we lived through one only 10 years ago. I mean, in and of itself, that can cause recession on the scale of a depression unless there is massive policy intervention. So just to sort of briefly recap then, I started with the idea of stepping on a hose pipe, hopefully temporary and almost, if you like, artificial interruption of production and trade that might go away quickly. We're now talking about something that is not just on a bigger scale, but also a much longer duration, and that now has innately economic causes as well as consequences. And I think what that's going to result in, of course, is that the recession we experience is going to be sort of either U-shaped or L-shaped. So what I mean by U-shaped is either we're going to, well, we've already experienced the drop. We're either going to sort of stay in depressed conditions for a long time before we eventually get a robust recovery, or worse still, L-shaped, we never really do get a robust recovery. And unfortunately, we know what that looks like. An L-shaped recession is pretty much what we just went through. This is what economic historians, I think, used to call a depressed upswing. The last great example prior to the last 10 years was in the 1930s. Any student of economic history knows that despite all of the efforts that were made in the 1930s, it really eventually took the onset of World War II to really boost production, employment back to levels that were last seen in the late 1920s. And well, L-shaped recessions then give rise to really depressed upswing, weak booms that leave us with the sorts of questions that were our preoccupation about 3 or 4 months ago. You know, how come unemployment is so low, but, you know, nobody's bargaining for higher wages, people are still struggling, you know, how do you reconcile the statistics with the commonplace experience of the economy? And well, one reason is that in actual fact, there's a lot more slack than there appears to be from some of these measures of ratios. Because a typical L-shaped recession, you get a big drop, and then growth never is really robust enough to restore output to something like the path that it was on prior to the recession. All right, so this brings us to policy then. I mean, the one thing that we've learned in the 20th century is that if the economy goes into the tank, you don't sit idly by, least of all when you get these recessions of historic proportions. And of course, there's already been a policy response as well there might. The most prominent feature of that to date has been the CARES Act. I'd give the CARES Act a 6 out of 10 if I was, I'm doing grading at the moment. In any case, it's the end of the semester, so 6 out of 10 for the CARES Act. Why? Well, firstly, I think the scale of it as an initial fiscal policy response was about right. It was $2 trillion, which sounds huge. But remember, the US is a $20 trillion economy. And if you're stepping on the hose pipe, if you're choking off production and trade, you know, to such an extent, then essentially $2 trillion is basically 10 weeks of income. So it was about the right size. I think the problem was that the structure and distribution of the disbursements was really, well, I won't say all wrong, but I think too little attention was paid to enabling small businesses and workers to shelter in place. Too much reliance on unemployment and boosting unemployment insurance instead of actually paying workers to remain on the job, but being essentially paid by the state rather than by the businesses which they're ostensibly employed. So those are the kinds of problems that I think with the composition of the Act, with its structure. Now, I've mentioned distribution here, so that gives me a kind of cheap opportunity, I suppose, to reach back to the point that Zed made at the start in his introduction, and also allude at least to the piece by Robert Reich that I distributed, because in typical fashion, I'm a macroeconomist, so we tend to sort of obsess about these aggregate outcomes and what's happening to the general economy. But we mustn't ever forget that anything that happens to the general economy always involves some distribution or redistribution. And it has to be said, of course, that you know, the distribution of the effects of the crisis so far is far from even. So the Reich piece, I think, draws attention in a particularly sharp and useful and important way to some of the domestic aspects of the sort of distributional effects. And these include, of course, I mean, most obviously the fact that the folks who've been told to just get on with it, to go to work because they're essential workers, with perhaps the exception of some wealthy and well-paid members of the medical profession, include hospital orderlies, bus drivers, janitors, garbage collectors. These are among the lowest paid, low employment security members of the population. They're also disproportionately Black, Hispanic, and or women. So you start to see here where the sort of class emphasis that Reich rightly starts with, where you've got kind of professionals just going home and using Zoom and the internet, but members of what we would sort of think of as unequivocally the blue-collar working class being told to just get on with it, regardless of how much or a little PPE they have access to. That class dimension immediately starts to have an overlap with gender and racial dimensions, and the distribution of this crisis and its effects is far from equal. There's also, and let's not forget, an international dimension to this inequality. Part of the process then of liquidity preference involves capital flight out of less developed and middle income countries and back to the US. The US dollar is the world currency. That's where wealth would rather be right now. So you have capital flight from less developed and middle income countries, which can also create exchange rate problems that start to magnify any of the problems that they're having domestically by virtue of the onset of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, worst case scenarios, you end up in a situation like Bangladesh, where, you know, you're actually a poor developed, underdeveloped country. So apart from, of course, the life and death matter of access to health, you also have, you know, garment workers who aren't being paid a dime by Gap or anybody like that, and are being driven to the point of starvation, even quite literally, even if they're not themselves affected by the COVID virus. So we mustn't lose sight at any point in time of the distributive aspects of this crisis, either nationally, that is domestically, or internationally. Going forward then, there is, I think, inevitably going to be more policy. There certainly needs to be. And that policy is going to have to attend to two things, I think, if it's going to do the trick. It's going to have to address the onset of what I've identified as some of the demand side problems that we now face. It's also going to simultaneously have to be far more involved than we've seen to date in the organization of production and distribution and exchange, the sort of structure of the economy, the supply side, if you want to call it that. Not only do we, of course, need people to spend on goods and services, but those goods and services have to be produced and exchanged under safe conditions. And we all know some of the sort of poor examples that we've seen on the television from parts of the country where there has been now this race to reopen without any form of organization. In other words, a sort of reopening at any cost. And this brings me, I think, to the point that I'll end on, which is that it is now in the process of looking forward. I mean, we understand the scale of the crisis, I think. We have a sense of what ought to be done or what needs to be done. But this really brings us to, let's call it the political economy of the moment. And in particular, the political economy of the policy moment. First of all, there is, of course, the leadership deficit, let's say. The question of the basic competence of certain national leaders to really rise to the challenge as I've mapped it out, organizing, supplementing both the demand and the supply side of whole economies. Do they really have the talent? Do they really have the competence to take on that task? I can think of a few cases, not just one, I'm sure you can too, where that answer, in my opinion, is in the negative. I think what we also have to be aware of, though, is that it's actually not just, in my opinion, a question of competence. There's also an issue here of self-interest and ideology. Here's what I mean. A.J.P. Taylor, famous British historian, is associated with the idea that the Luftwaffe was the architect of the British welfare state. Which sounds like a crazy idea, but the basic idea goes like this. Suppose you live in the East End of London in 1941. You step outside your door one day and you notice that your neighbor across the street, their house is gone. It's been hit by a bomb overnight in the Blitz as a result of carpet bombing, okay? The reaction to that was there but for the grace of God go I, right? If that bomb had been 30 yards across the street, I would have been dead, my house would have been gone. And what Taylor and others argued was that this created a sense of common vulnerability to an external risk that really required a socialized response. This is where the National Health Service came from, effectively. And obviously that's a very reductive argument, but there's something to it. The realization that there was, or there were such things as common external risks that required a socialized response. You didn't just step outside your house during the Blitz, notice that your neighbor's house had been bombed and say, well, obviously that's their fault, that's their poor housekeeping. And yet, that's exactly what we're seeing right now, for example, in some of the responses to the financial duress that's being experienced by some of the states where this crisis has been worst. We're hearing political rhetoric about fiscal irresponsibility, bailing out failed states, that the federal government apparently shouldn't do this, and so on and so forth. That strikes me as being the equivalent of essentially blaming your neighbor's housekeeping for the fact that their house, not yours, was hit by a bomb during an overnight car pick bombing raid. But it has a purpose, because I think that the people who are propagating these views have a vested interest in suppressing the AJP Taylor response, the notion that there's a common external threat which requires a socialized response, which requires a ramping up of the state, right? That there should be public health, that in fact, what's wrong with our education system while we're at it? Why has the public sector retreated? Why is there so much student debt? How about, again, public purpose, public response? It's very much the case, in my opinion, that those who would perhaps stand to lose most from this, which is the very small minority of the most wealthy members of society who don't need public education, they don't need public health, they don't even need publicly provided security to some extent. I'm sure that as this crisis has demonstrated, and if push comes to shove, they just get into the helicopter and go to their 7th house in the Caribbean and, just get out. So, if you don't need these public services and you're not willing to pay for them, and, and if nobody has the countervailing power to hold you to account as part of a quid pro quo, well, then, what you get is something that looks like the last 30 or 40 years of ever sort of creeping tax cuts, retreat of the welfare state, and I would say a lack of preparedness for events like this. And also one, unfortunately, that might now significantly hamper the policy response. Particularly, I think, as what we're hearing is a resistance to the idea that a competent public policy can really step in and essentially save the day here, for fear that that idea might catch on and it might result in a larger scale, well, if I can put it in with the usual new school drama, reordering of society. I mean, it certainly would be a reordering, I think, relative to the last 30 or 40 years. Well, okay, so maybe I'll stop there.
That's a great ending, yeah. Okay, so we have a few questions. Just to remind everyone, you can either open up the Q&A dialog box and type out a question, or go into the participants kind of thing on the right side that also has an attendees section. And then in that attendees section, raise your hand and I'll call on you. You can ask your question on video. So I think I'll combine two questions, the first two questions from Giuseppe and Robert, where they're both asking about previous recessions and the kind of shapes of the curves you see. So they asked about the 1982 recession and the 2008 recession. So, what are the shapes of the curves in those cases? And Robert, wanted to know, so what was the effect of the 1982 recession?
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I mean, recessions can have different characters. If you look at the 2008 recession, I would say that looks in the final analysis more L-shaped. Remember, a statistical recession is always going to be fairly short-lived because we're actually looking at 2 or more successive quarters of negative GDP growth. And so if you look back even to the Great Recession, it looks relatively short-lived. The reason I'm describing it as L-shaped is that if you look at the path of the time path of, that is the path over time of real GDP, it sort of goes off a cliff and then the previous rate of growth resumes, but that doesn't allow you to catch up with and make up for all of the income that you lost in the drop. So that's an L-shaped recession, effectively, where there really isn't a phase of really rapid growth that pushes you back up to where you would have been on a kind of time path counterfactually had the recession never happened. Now, 1982 was different because, of course, 1982 notoriously in the UK and the US had an important policy component. It's not right to say that those recessions were exclusively policy-induced events, but those were the years of the monetarist experiment where there was an effort to restrict the money supply, something which most macroeconomists would agree now, and many did at the time, is actually not possible in principle, and certainly not possible without inducing enormous negative real effects, that is, drops in output and increases in unemployment. But the monetarist experiment was actually curtailed very rapidly. That really was like a policymaker putting their foot on the hosepipe and then taking it back off. Now, there were other things happening in the economy, and as a result of that, of course, the 70s and the 80s are really part and parcel of a lengthier period of interregnum between the sort of breakdown of the so-called golden age period from roughly 1945 to 73, and then the onset of this more recent period, post-1990, where there has been albeit, I would argue, with adverse and to some extent self-contradictory consequences for distribution and inequality, the return to somewhat more robust macroeconomic performance, unemployment and inflation rates that are more comparable with the 50s and 60s than they are with the 70s and 80s. So it's important not to get the sort of specifics, and in particular the policy contribution to the events in 79 and 82 mixed up with the broader kind of economic stagnation of the 70s and 80s, which really well, this is what some macroeconomists of a regulationist or social structure of accumulation bent would describe as a period of interregnum between properly functioning institutional regimes that are conducive to the type of low inflation, low unemployment performance that we saw in the 50s and 60s, and actually did see again from sort of roughly 1990 to 2007.
That's great. Thanks. So Mark has a question about the lockdown and about the kind of justifications that are given for the lockdown. So he draws our attention to how there's debates among philosophers of science about different kinds of justifications that could be given. And he notes that Alex Broadbent has argued against the lockdown in South Africa. So he has a very general question.
Yeah.
What do you think from an economic or political perspective justifies or doesn't justify the lockdown? And he ends by asking, how can well-being and health be brought in as a consideration with or against dominant forms of economic reasoning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, it's far deeper and broader than I can do justice to. But what I would say, even just briefly, is that the first thing I think that comes to an economist's mind is the possibility of a trade-off. Economists love trade-offs. They're likely to see them even where they don't exist. And I think, you certainly have to be careful of thinking in terms of a trade-off here, but you could begin at least with the idea of a trade-off between health and well-being and economic performance. I mean, just send everybody back to work and the economy comes back, right? your sort of health and safety consequences are dire. Alternatively, just shut the economy down, everybody shelters in home, so health and safety are sort of maximized, but there's no economy left. So it looks like a simple trade-off. It might not be, of course, because, well, we've been talking about V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped recessions. How about W-shaped? You know, if you rush to send people back to work, thinking that there's a simple trade-off between more economic activity and, okay, it's a price I'm willing to pay, less health and safety. Well, the problem is, of course, that this is an extremely contagious disease. You may ramp up the health and safety problems to such an extent that you actually have to shut the economy back down again. So then you enter into this kind of W-shaped phenomena, which is really a way of saying that you're just going to cycle through phases of more or less economic activity and ill health as you reopen, shut down, reopen, shut down. So beware false trade-offs. But if you accept that there is a trade-off to some extent, I mean, I noticed a recent working paper circulating by the National Bureau of Economic Research, where someone was saying, well, okay, this is where you enter into this, of course, precarious notion of the value of a statistical life. You know, how many people are you willing to have die in order to raise GDP by 2 percentage points? Well, okay, so what dollar value do you put on a human life? And of course, I mean, economists, actuaries even, I mean, actuaries do this all the time when they're working for insurance companies. You know, this does happen, but seldom in circumstances like this, where you reckon yourself as a sort of central government policymaker to be literally sending people into peril for the sake of boosting, you know, production and output. So these are sort of thorny questions. And I was interested to see in the NBER paper that the author ultimately flinched at the idea of putting so much of a burden on such a kind of slender concept here as the value of a statistical life when trying to make policy in this case. Again, that concept is in common use in insurance companies. It's how, you know, they figure out how much to charge you by way of a premium for your car insurance, right? Who are you going to run into with what likelihood? And, you know, are they likely to be a wealthy doctor or just some kind of poor farmer? I mean, all of these things are routinely done, but not in a way and by people who then turn around and say, right, I'm going to lean on this calculation to the extent that I'm actually going to send, you know, millions of people back into the workplace because I prefer the prospect on this calculation of a 2% increase in GDP. So I think it's a very deep question.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up question that kind of gets maybe to the heart of what was being asked, which is, so you could think about the invocation of economic considerations in two different ways. One way would be to say, look, economic considerations have a much broader reach than you realize, that actually they do tell us about well-being, and you know, a proper assessment of the long-term economic costs of suddenly reopening everything would show us that that will be detrimental, that, you know, too hasty a reopening will actually be economically bad, and that's a good indicator of what's wrong with that strategy.
Yeah.
A very different kind of response would be to say, you know, there's a fundamental limit to what economic assessments can tell us about what really matters. And I wonder, which side of that kind of response do you fall on?
Well, I'm inclined to fall on the latter, to be honest, because, and again, I notice even, you know, some of my colleagues in the profession, I've invoked this NBER paper, are inclined to be recognizing the limits of their own calculus at this point. You know, there's been a debate for decades in even introductory economics textbooks about, you know, why do we fetishize GDP? I mean, all sorts of people, especially women, are doing all sorts of unpaid work in the home. There's all of these other things when we start to think of it that make us happy, for example. So, you know, and I've always thought that, you know, the most satisfactory response to that is to actually explicitly realize the limits of GDP. What is it supposed to measure? And not to actually keep trying to add things into it that make it a better measure of happiness or social welfare somehow defined. I mean, those are important in exercises, and we have things like the Human Development Index that attempt to be much broader in their reach. My sense has always been that economists should essentially stay in their lane. They should be honest about what they are talking about, what they are measuring, and therefore what falls more or less outside their purview. Not that they should disregard that, but that really then, so in my view, this isn't the time to just say, oh yeah, we've got the tools to take all of that into account. I actually don't think that we do. So yeah, I mean, in some ways then we are talking here narrowly about how to think about the resuscitating an economy, but it's going to take more than just economists or prevailing economic tools to figure out how to do that properly.
Okay, great. Luis has a question that I'd like to raise, where basically it's about whether we should think of this, recession and perhaps depression that we're going into as a disruption of, where we were headed, or is it really just accelerating where we already were headed? So does it involve like some kind of U-turn because of an exogenous factor?
Yeah.
Or is it really just accelerating existing inequalities and structural problems that were bound to happen, but just, making them sooner rather than later?
Well, I can give two answers to that, right? The optimist in me wants it to be the first of those, that this is a moment for fundamental structural change, and the pessimist tells me that it won't be. And I am reminded that this sort of notion of how bad is bad enough before we get change for the better. This is a long-standing debate now, going back at least 40 years. Whatever happened in the 70s and 80s. There were certainly moments in the 1980s in the UK when I was growing up, when the argument was, look, things are just going to get so bad that people are going to look for something fundamentally different, and that really didn't happen. I sincerely thought that the financial crisis and Great Recession would lead to much more fundamental structural change and reform than ever it did. Instead, what we've just had is a sort of patched up version of the model that was running in the 90s and 2000s, which to some extent then has proved itself to be institutionally robust, even though it isn't economically robust, because many of the trends that we were observing in the 90s and 2000s, and that some of us were worrying about at that time, have just carried on or even been magnified since then. So what concerns me, and this does go back to what I was saying very briefly about how we see the distribution of the harm that this crisis is already doing, is very uneven, and it is falling on the shoulders of the people who have already lost out over the past 40 years. So it's difficult to see right now that there's any obvious turning point. But again, I think a lot of this also depends on this, political economy of the moment, right? Do people suddenly understand this as a shared vulnerability to an external risk that requires a socialized investment? Do the scales fall from their eyes? And do they finally realize that, smiling every time they get a tuppence halfpenny tax cut, and then wondering why there's no money for public schools or roads, why it is that, tuition even at public universities keeps going up way faster than their income? Do they join the dots and insist on some kind of revitalization of, the economy as a public enterprise? Or does that realization never occur to them? Is it possible for, influence to be peddled sufficiently that people come away with the message that, Massachusetts and New York, they're just badly run states. There's no way we should be bailing them out here. And well, in that case, then we have more of this kind of divide and conquer that I think is actually leaving very many people behind economically. The economy is really running increasingly for the benefit, not just of the top 10% or even 5%, but increasingly the top 1% of the income distribution. But nevertheless, there's a sort of political coalition that keeps that going. So I
Yes,
have
so
to say
here's
on the
a
back.
big picture follow-up to that, which is, do you think economic considerations will ever be sufficient to really bring about any kind of structural change? Or do you think it would
Nope.
require reconceiving how we think about the problem? And, on the model of World War II, your analogy there is apt, that maybe we would have to think about the problem itself in totally different terms for there to be any kind of structural change.
Yeah. Well, my colleague Tom Pally, who used to be at the New School, has spent many decades saying that the left preaches solidarity, the right practices it. I proposed a new take on that about a year ago. That the left treats Gramsci as a textbook, the right treats it as an instruction manual. And I think we're being given an object lesson in that actually by the Trump administration that, if you look at the essentially the economic policies of the administration, and again, they're manifest right now in this idea that we shouldn't have a federal response that gives aid to states. It's the state's fault that they're in this shape. They're irresponsible, right? It's their bad housekeeping that resulted in their house being bombed, as it were. I think that is all part and parcel of creating a narrative that people can then latch onto. Simple is true, and that it isn't the case that the economy will out. That the people who are actually experiencing the worst economic consequences of the structure of the economy writ large, the current moment, will necessarily sort of rise up and say, right, we need something fundamentally different. It isn't that simple. And I'm fairly convinced, actually, that the failure of the financial crisis and Great Recession to break the grip of what is commonly referred to as neoliberalism is a good illustration of that.
So Homayun has a question related to this, which is, what about exploring the possibility of just embracing the new normal and not even fantasizing about any kind of return to a previous normal or some future utopia where we just embrace working from home and appreciate the good effects it's had on the environment? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a radical proposition in a sense, because I don't think it's the most likely thing to happen. But I can certainly understand the motivation for the question. That perhaps it does raise questions about what's it all about in any case. This goes back to this larger question of, is it just the economy in the small, or is it something called human welfare in the large that we're supposed to be pursuing? And of course, I teach by trade courses on growth and distribution, and students very often, independently of the current moment, have said, well, you're always banging on about growth, but the environment is being destroyed and all the rest of it. And also say, well, look, understanding the process of growth doesn't mean you're actually advocating for more of it. It's possible to advocate for zero growth, in which case the whole problem boils down to distribution. What mechanisms exist? What mechanisms would you need to create to make sure that you don't just end up in a situation where very many people become extremely poor, and there's very few who are living high on the hog in a zero growth environment. So I think it's a question again of it's certainly possible to imagine re-engineering the entire system so that it's just pursuing different objectives. And the good news is, in some sense, we have the technology available for that. We kind of do understand things about the growth process, how it interacts with distribution. It's just a question of recalibrating the objectives. Let's have less growth and focus more on distribution, so that more or less everybody can have a somehow defined decent standard of living that is also compatible with certain environmental standards, for example. I think it really comes down to a question of political will, and in whose interests would this be? And, are they ever going to put together the kind of dominant political coalition? So, we've gone from...
So let me give you two scenarios to play out. What's your most optimistic scenario for this leading to a genuine challenge to kind of business as usual neoliberalism? And what's your most pessimistic, model for thinking about how everything will go back to the worst version of the normal state affairs? This is a way of rephrasing Ali Riz's question to try to give you two radical extremes there, most optimistic and most pessimistic outcomes.
Well, I think the most pessimistic is unfortunately, in some ways, the most likely, and that is that we just get a continuation of business as usual over the last 40 years. I'm just noticing here a comment by Eugene that, Larry Summers suggesting let's just dump the toxic waste in the third world because lives in the third world aren't worth anything in any case. And of course, Larry, we know, used to be the Secretary of the Treasury. He was and he'll be involved, I'm sure, in any future Democratic administration should Biden prevail. So, the choices that we're being directed towards in the short term, as we approach this November in the US, I don't think are going to bring any radical change. So I think in that sense, business as usual is the most likely, as well as perhaps the most pessimistic outcome. Again, the more optimistic vision is that you do get this realization that, look, despite the essentially the political rhetoric and the framing of the way society works over the last 40 years, that it's really all just down to the individual. If you come out ahead, that's because of your brilliance. Nobody else had any other part in it. It was just all down to you. Meanwhile, if you fail, that's your fault too. So, get on with it, as it were. And you see this in, well, you can't walk into Barnes and Noble, but if you could, all of these kind of self-promoting books, how I got where I am and how you can too. And, they're not books about, how it was a bunch of great teachers who helped me, through these various stages of education, how my life was saved by some, socialized medical system in this part of the world. And oh my God, what did I bring to the party at the end of the day? Turns out my contribution was rather marginal. Anything I've done is this product of this enormous social enterprise. That's actually literally the history that I would write of myself. And I know that some other academics would as well. Mark Blythe at Brown University has said much the same thing. That we all, and I've said to Mark that we should start a narrative here. People who regard themselves as proud products of the welfare state. My life was saved by the NHS when I was 2 years old. I had a public education right through graduating from Cambridge University. I was even paid a stipend as an undergraduate because of an assessment of my parents' income. I mean, this kind of world is unimaginable to most people of student age these days, but in fact, it existed even in the 70s and 80s. The question, I think, is if can you recapture the kind of mentality that calls for the construction of that type of society? Again, it's actually not that radical a departure, because as my own life experience illustrates, we're talking about systems that existed only a few decades ago. We're not talking about, conjectured utopias that have never existed. And, I think that was it would have been one of the problems with the Sanders campaign, is getting bogged down in definitions of socialism, when at the end of the day, all you were saying is, look, this is just a package of, if you want to give it a name, social democratic policies that would have been considered bog standard in any well-run advanced economy 50 years ago. It's not radical. It's quite straightforward. We know how to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay.
Yeah, so let me ask you then about a kind of new, maybe a new possibility, not a return, to 50 years ago, but maybe a generational shift that adds some new factors to the equation. As you were talking about, the kind of rational response to a situation like today, saying that people hoard purchasing power.
Mm-hmm.
as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, but okay, but what about the generation of Americans who've grown up in the wake of 2008, who've heard endless lectures about how all they have to do is not buy avocado toast and then they'll be able to buy an apartment in Manhattan or whatever,
Right.
you know? And so they've lived in the shadow of one recession. There's now a bigger recession that brings with it even less hope for that kind of like, oh, save up and the future will be great, baby boomer fantasy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that will then lead to totally new kinds of political arrangements where new possibilities emerge.
Yeah.
And if you have any thoughts about how that might, change the dynamics of the situation.
Well, one thing that suggests that what you've just said is perhaps more likely than any sudden short-term realization that we should reorganize society is if you look at economic outcomes, as you've just started doing, on a generational basis, and you find that even since the Great Recession, for example, it is the baby boom generation that has continued to accumulate wealth, whereas other younger generations have failed to accumulate wealth or have even found that their net worth has declined. So, eventually, if you think of the baby boomers just sort of falling off the end of the graph because, they're not going to live to be 150, then you could conjecture being left with a population that is dominated by generations for whom the economy really hasn't been working. Now, of course, the only thing that runs interference with that is the process of inheritance. So, the baby boomers may own the wealth right now, but who do they make bequests to? And do they succeed in recreating themselves in the form of a cohort, again, that is relatively perhaps small in sort of simple-minded, democratic politics term, 5 or 10% of the population surely can't put together a winning political coalition, but is, as it were, sufficiently savvy to put together a coalition that essentially keeps their position of privilege in power. I still think that's the challenge, even if we do get to the point where, numerically you have the dominance of generations who, really have not been able to move out of their parents' houses, get into housing, buy an affordable education, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so I'll end with one final question from Eddie that introduces another variable we haven't talked about yet, which is China. What are your views on China's role economically in this, whole affair? And what we'll see next and the possibilities that might emerge?
Well, that stumped me a little bit. I'm not a China expert, and I must admit I haven't given a lot of thought to that. I suppose one thing that is just a simple response. I really would have to give that a lot more thought, because obviously China has emerged over the last 40 years, and especially perhaps over the last 15 or so, as or 15 or 20, as a much more sort of significant presence in international political economy. But one thing, of course, that we got a very early lesson in was the vulnerability of now internationalized supply chains. And of course, there is a heavy dependence on China, if for nothing else, than basically supplying an awful lot of component parts that we realize that we're thoroughly dependent upon if we want to, put automobiles together in the Southwest, or even get hold of face masks and other like products. So,
So is it the end of globalization as we know it?
Well, I doubt it, because I think, again, the forces that have a vested interest in this pattern of, endless subcontracting, there's a good reason why, a lot of the garment manufacture is now in Bangladesh and not in the West Riding of Yorkshire or something like that. And again, it works to the benefit of some people more than others. So I don't think an event like this is necessarily going to just sort of lead to some mass reversal, rather than an effort to sort of re-engineer this, the system, or possibly even just ignoring this as a sort of a once-in-a-century blip. Let's not overlook the fact that humans are sometimes pretty good at forgetting, right? We don't always learn robustly from crises and make sure that next time we're prepared. You could argue that what we're experiencing right now is a good example of that, given the problems that we had only 10 years ago with a crisis of similar proportions, even if different origins. So anyway, I've drifted off topic.
No, that's
Yeah.
it's an appropriately pessimistic ending to a very real discussion. So thanks, Mark. Thanks to everybody else. Miranda helped organize this event. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And I hope you will register for the future talks. We're going to have them on Mondays and Thursdays. Next Monday we're off because of the holiday, but join us next Thursday for a great talk by Shannon Mattern in anthropology and media studies.
Great.
So,
and my thanks also, Zed, to you and Miranda and our others, Kirill and Robert, who've organized this. And thanks to the audience for being good sports. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer more of the questions, but as I can see them flashing by here, there's been some great issues and questions that have been raised. So thanks to all of you.
thanks, everybody. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.